Hi there, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on the new science standards, Challenging Grit and Rigor. My name's Francis Vidgen. I'm a former teacher myself. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. And I think about grit and rigor and the next generation science standards quite a lot. I think that the next generation science standards are perhaps one of the most useful tools from a standards perspective for developing grit and rigor in our students that we may have ever seen to this point. I think the reason for that is the involvement of science and engineering practices and the appeal to what science and engineering is really about, the idea of innovation and about empowering students to develop higher order thinking skills, the creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills that it takes to be an innovator, is something that's quite unique to the next generation science standards. So as we go through this webinar today, I want to let you know a few things. One, if you're on the live session, I'm going to save some time for questions at the end, and you'll see on your screen a little window that you may be able to expand, or it may already be expanded for you, where you can drop questions in. I'll do my best to answer some of those along the way, but any that remain I will try to grab at the end. KnowAtom is based just north of Boston. We've been around for about 12 years, and we're a team of educators who have been working to develop curriculum and actually implementing curriculum that entire time that's hands-on, that places students in the role of scientist and engineer, that helps use that classroom opportunity to develop higher order thinking skills, and to do so by equipping educators, specifically schools, districts, but educators who are in the classroom whose environment, really the environment that we create, is what produces learning outcomes, creates the opportunity or not. And so that's the connection here to grit and to rigor as we kind of jump in. If you are on a recording after the live session, if you have any questions or are looking for access to resources, please feel free to reach out. You can go to contact us on KnowAtom's page, or you can use the email and telephone information at the end of the webinar. I'll put that up there for you. Okay, so let's jump in. So first and foremost, to talk about the role of higher order thinking. So next generation science standards, because they exist in 3 dimensions, they're not just content, they are not just phenomena, but there are actual skills that students need to develop so that they can develop and use the content and connect how that content is interrelated through its phenomena, the way that it manifests itself in nature. And in order to do that, that's where we get this focus on higher order thinking. When you think about Bloom's taxonomy, we typically think about a 6-level pyramid, from lowest order thinking, being remembering, going on to understanding, then applying, then analyzing, evaluating, creating, all the way up a pyramid. But in fact, with these new standards, creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously. And the reason that I mention that is that when we think about grit, which we're going to define here in a minute, this new next generation learning environment is much more demanding than the traditional standards, which are based on facts that students memorize and recall to demonstrate proficiency. These new standards require students to create, evaluate, and analyze using skills, developing out content in order to answer questions and solve problems, because scientists, these new standards define for us, science is knowledge from experimentation, and that scientists ask questions and they answer those questions through planning experiments, carrying them out, and using that information to form conclusions. Engineers use that knowledge in order to solve problems. And so they develop prototypes, test them, and use that data to form evidence-based conclusions about whether this prototype should be scaled as technology. So in order to develop those skills, students must be able to create, evaluate, and analyze. That requires a shift. It requires a shift from an environment where students expect that everything is the result of direct instruction. And so grit fits in here because, well, grit is it's what drives, it's sort of the internal, it's this internal driving mechanism that that causes students to kind of use determination in a direction. Okay, so when Angela, I'll give you an example. I think this might help. When Angela Duckworth interviewed the actor Will Smith about how he explains his success, he said that he didn't really see himself as particularly talented, but instead what he said is that he sees himself as somebody with a, quote, ridiculous, sickening work ethic. And she asked him further about that. She said, you know, how do you, if you don't have a particular amount of talent, you're just a hard worker, how do you explain your level of fame? And this is what he said literally. He said, the only thing I see that's distinctly different about me is that I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. I will not be outworked, period. You might have more, you know, talent, more smarts, more looks. You might be all of those things and have it up on me in 9 different categories. But if we get on a treadmill together, there's 2 things. You're going to get off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple. So I hope your takeaway from that is that grit is about having a goal and having determination. And so when you think about determination, it's really perseverance, okay? And the direction is about holding steady to a specific goal. So, you know, you think about this in the classroom. You know, perseverance is getting up and trying again. Holding steady to a goal is having focus. So just from an educator's perspective, I mean, you have to think about grit on 2 levels. And one of the things that you may have noticed when we talked about this webinar was we said, you know, will grit be the greatest predictor of student and teacher success in the new standards? And I think that it is absolutely, but it's not just for students, it's for teachers too. Because when you think about what goes on in a school day, there are a lot of different potential directions to move in. And there are a lot of different sort of things vying for our time, requirements that are placed on us. And so any one of those can become a kind of goal. And so what's important is to isolate those higher level goals and to have a culture in our school, so we think about this as teachers, you know, to have clear goals, but have a culture in our school that helps foster determination. From a student standpoint, you know, when you think about sort of fact-based standards that were prior to Next Generation, the goal was the right answer. And you didn't really have to persevere too hard other than remembering in order to meet that goal. That's not a recipe for grit. That's just a real basic, you know, low-level skill. Remember, you know, remember the definition, apply the definition to the blank next to the word. The new science standards involve practices of science and engineering, which means that our goal here is skill development and students being able to use those skills to develop and use content. In order to do that is going to take a lot of perseverance on the student's behalf because this is all scenario based. That these are performance expectations, and so it's not the kind of thing that a you know, a student is going to be able to remember because it's not going to be the result of direct instruction. So the grittiness connection to Next Generation Science Standards for a student, so the teacher being, you know, persevering and also clear goal setting, persevering in that coaching students and skill development. But on the student's side, it's actually persevering within a task, within a challenge, in order to meet the goals, the expectations, and actually perform the standard, the expectations of the standard. So, you know, it might sound like grit is, you know, this kind of buzzy term. Angela, a lot of what I'm going to be showing you and discussing with you today is an adaptation or an explanation of aspects of Angela Duckworth's research and work that she published in a 2016 book called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. But behind this research is Angela Duckworth's findings that over and over, above all common metrics of success that people use, like IQ, like SAT scores, like some kind of measure of raw talent and so on, that all of these were less predictive of success than what she calls grit, and grit being passion and perseverance, the determination and direction. And she puts this in common language really by saying that our potential is one thing, but what we do with it is quite another. And I think as teachers, in what we think about in the science classroom, we as teachers have great potential to impact our students' lives. Our students have great potential, to fulfill their life with meaning and purpose and innovation and so on. But that potential goes unrealized unless we actually have determination and direction to do something with it, and that's kind of this grit component. And so, in terms of the book, I'm not going to go into the book examples much, but I would highly recommend, if you have not read the book Grit, maybe you've seen a TED Talk that Angela Duckworth has done, I would highly recommend reading the book because she uses great examples from everywhere from salespeople in the field to students at West Point to students in her own class as an educator in San Francisco and in New York. But what grit looks like in the classroom, and this is one of our clients' classrooms actually in northern Iraq. This is what it looks like. Okay, students engaged with purpose and determination to solve a problem or answer a question. So one of the things I like about books like Grit is that it helps give us language for the things I think we already know. Of course we know that grit matters. Maybe we haven't sat down and put to words, pen and paper, the way that Angela Duckworth has, and have the evidence to support it the way her research does. But generally we know, I think quality educators know that when they see students who are engaged, whether it looks like this across a classroom, whether it looks like this in a student team, okay, or like this in a student team. Whether it involves paper and pencil, whether it involves, physical manipulatives. What grit looks like in the classroom is students engaged in trying to manifest their ideas. And that's where we see next generation science standards coming into play here, because the question is with next generation science standards, what's the goal? What's its connection to grit? And when students are in the role of scientist, when students are in the role of engineer, then what they have there is an opportunity to see purpose, and this is important, and Angela Duckworth's research backs this up. It's an opportunity to see personal purpose and relevance in what's going on in the classroom, the way these students do. But it's also an opportunity to see its value for others. So, that can happen in these kind of classrooms far away or classrooms right here in the US. When a student sees a connection to what they're doing, when they see personal relevance and an opportunity to manifest their ideas, then that's investing students in their learning. Okay, it's making learning student-centered, personal, and it's students taking risks, personally investing. Having that be something that has real-world relevance, that is contemporary in its nature. You can open a newspaper and see a connection to what you're learning. And it's something that a student can care about, that they can connect with, those kind of concept to concept, concept to world, concept to self connections, then what we have is a value for others. Okay? And so purpose and passion are fed by that type of experience in the classroom. And next generation science standards help facilitate that through what I'm showing you here in this diagram and I described earlier, which is that nature of science and engineering, the idea that scientists ask questions and they answer those questions through experimentation. They give us new scientific knowledge, and that engineers identify and solve problems using that knowledge to develop technology through prototyping. And that math is applied throughout because it's an opportunity to make the world and pursuing questions and problems quantitative, objective, okay, and not qualitative or subjective. And that's key for being able to replicate our experiments, whether we're students or scientists as professionals in companies. So one of the key pieces I think that folks struggle with in terms of redesigning science tasks to motivate and invest students in their learning, the way that we've kind of been describing, is letting go, to allow student independence and shift away from teacher-centered instruction. So that idea that I kind of put forward a second ago, what you see on the left, that idea that students are using their skills to develop and use their knowledge to try and solve a problem or question that nobody has shown them how to solve, versus what you see on the right, where as teachers perhaps we try to hold control. So, Angela Duckworth talks about being distracted by talent, and this idea that exceptional natural students outperform those with less talent, but her research shows quite the opposite. And in her own experience that she shares in her book, Grit, Duckworth saw that lower level high school math students were outperforming expectations. And she tells a story of a specific student named David who was this quiet, hard worker in her low level math class and not the most vocal or outwardly engaging. But she mentioned over time, or the purpose of mentioning any of this, was that over time she came to notice that David's work improved to the point that she felt that he didn't belong in the class because he was turning in perfect work. So she took him to guidance and helped him get into an upper level class and helped him switch. And later he came back and he told her that when he got to that upper level class, he was behind. And he was so far behind after the switch that he got a D on his first test. So again, you need to think about Angela Duckworth as a researcher, as a career changer going from management consulting into teaching and so on. So, as a researcher, I guess it prompted her to ask this question of how did he deal with getting that D? Because she has this interest in grit. And he said, well, I felt bad, but I didn't dwell on it. I knew I had to focus on what to do next. So I went back to the teacher and asked for help. And I basically tried to figure out what I did wrong and what I needed to do differently. So that right there, that student's example, I tried to figure out what I did wrong and what I needed to do differently. That is grit. I try, if I was to change what he said, I would say something like, I remained focused on the goal and I was determined to figure out how I could reach that goal. That's what grit is. And so when we think about a next generation science classroom, these students on the left, they have a goal. What's that goal? To solve, in this case, they're in the role of engineer, is to solve that problem. Do they know how they're going to solve it? No. They have some skills, they have some knowledge. In order to get from the skills and knowledge that they have to solve that goal requires them to figure out how, what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And along the way, they're going to do things wrong. And that means that that's going to be an opportunity to learn from what they did wrong, figure out what they need to do differently, and then move ahead. That's how they're going to achieve their goal. So what you see on the right is kind of very different than this. On the right is a teacher trying to get students to copy her and her ideas by modeling and demonstrating and pre-teaching. And that's very different than what you see on the left, which is challenging students to develop skills to develop and use content um, and do it for themselves. And so, you know, if a student, and again, if we think about this as having direction and determination, you might say, well, what's the connection here? Because, you know, what you see on the left is much harder, and it actually takes direction and determination. If we see what we, in this picture on the right, it doesn't take, you know, the teacher is going to give the direction and going to, you know, tell the students they have to do it. So, you know, I guess that's some level of determination. It's different because on the right, students don't have that personal connection. It's not their idea. They're parroting. On the left, the students aren't parroting. They're actually using what's theirs, and they're learning from it. They're actually investing themselves in it. And that's, from a next generation science standpoint, really important, because the next generation science standards come from the national, well, they started in a much longer process, and that's how KnowAtom was able to become aligned, you know, that's how we're aligned now. And we have, you know, thousands and thousands of students engaged in next generation hands-on inquiry in classrooms across the country and around the world with regular classroom teachers, because this has been part of a process. And you see this quote coming from 2011. It actually goes all the way back to, you know, 2009 and, you know, perhaps even 2006. There was some things you may say that were the sort of early bits of next generation science standards. But this is from the National Research Council, which was part of that early process. And it's the definition of effective STEM instruction, or science instruction, science, technology, engineering, and math. And it has to do, you can see how grit is helpful here, okay? Having determination and direction, passion and purpose is so important. Effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. And what I want you to take away from this is that it's our instruction as educators, it's our curriculum, the way that it's designed, that the class experience that's intentionally nurturing, that it's not just happening in grade 4 or grade 5 or grade 8 or grade 11 or 12, but it's K 1, 2, 3, all the way along, intentionally nurturing. And the way that we design our curriculum and our lessons should be intentionally identifying and building on what students know and providing them with the opportunity to engage in the practices, or that's a particular word, it means skills, the skills specific to science and engineering. And those are the ones, those 8 science and engineering practices that come to us from the next generation science standards. So, you know, in order to do that in the spirit of next generation inquiry, really, which is a full inquiry model, I think we need to think about Duckworth's words, psychologically aware. You know, she says being psychologically aware is a huge part of teaching grit or parenting for grit, as she says she's oftentimes asked. So I think that term psychologically aware is a bit tough to grasp, so perhaps we could call it being thinking aware, or aware of our students' thinking, but also our thinking, and what their words mean and what our words mean, how the two interact. So that sounds, you know, very, I guess, not too concrete, but let's see if we can make that concrete. So, you know, when you think about, come up with a good example here. You know, when you think about how we get students to work towards a goal, or how we encourage goal setting, what we really need to do is ask ourselves, you know, what goals do children set? Why do they set them? And that will start to kind of suck us into this thinking about thinking, this metacognitive, psychologically aware sort of model, right? So one example, I'll give an example from an educator's standpoint. And you know, you'll often hear educators who are struggling say things like, you know, it's difficult to teach science because at the end of the day, the students just don't want to hear me tell them one more thing. So that may seem like a mundane comment to you, but it's very telling. It's very telling that that educator is not psychologically aware. It also is telling that they don't understand what it means to have full inquiry and release responsibility to their students to actually challenge them to develop and use their content and their skills in order to solve a problem or answer a question. And the reason that that comment is so telling is, number one, the teacher said that they don't want to hear me tell them one more thing. I can't tell them one more thing. It's not the educator's job to tell students anything, to be that sort of expert projecting information at students. And of course, when you think about from the student standpoint, why should they listen? They don't have a purpose for listening other than to sort of satisfy the teacher or get a check for participation or appropriate behavior in class. You know, the student's goal is, and students are naturally curious, so when you think about it, is a student wants to execute their curiosity. They want to discover a purpose. They want to connect with things that matter to them in their lives. And so when a teacher says, I'm struggling with science because at the end of the day I can't tell the students one more thing, it tells us that the teacher's not thinking about what the students' goals are and why students engage in class and what engages them. And in fact, that inquiry is not about us telling and sort of, you know, projecting information, which is different than pushing students. Pushing is different. Push and pull is different than projecting information. So, you know, I don't want to linger on this too much, but, you know, the key piece of it is that, you know, above all else, our students in K-12 are just like adults. They seek personal purpose and fulfillment. They're motivated by opportunity, dignity, respect, reward. And I think oftentimes we fall into traps, thinking that we have to make things entertaining or bombastic or fun because that's what gets students to engage, but it's actually not the case. You know, that's those, you know, making things entertaining, bombastic, and being superlative are kind of cheap hooks to try and get kids, or, you know, attention in a lot of cases and try to cause them to learn. But it doesn't work, and it's short-lived if it does work at all. Because if we want to focus on engagement, it's really about students seeing personal relevance and value for others in the work that's at hand, and that actually feeds grit, that feeds purpose, it feeds determination, it feeds passion, and that's how students learn to love things. It's why students invest themselves in things like you see on the left that are harder from, you know, pretty much every measure. This is harder than what you see over here. If you can just pay attention for 10 minutes, you can do whatever she's doing. Over here, you don't know. It's a black box. It's harder. You have to think about it. But it's actually more rewarding. It's more purposeful. It's more engaging than what you see over here, which you're going to get bored of and kind of give up. And I'm going to come back to that idea in a second. You see what you see on the left, or, you know, I've switched the pictures a little bit here, but what you see here with that teacher demonstrating, that's a traditional model of instruction. That traditional model of instruction is not set up for effective science instruction under the NGSS model, the National Research Council's definition. It also doesn't create space for psychological awareness. As you see here, the teacher's projecting information at students. They are the sage on the stage. The content flows through the teacher, and the student's role is to absorb it. Okay, just remember. So I'd argue that this traditional model actually destroys grit, that it destroys passion, perseverance, it destroys creativity, because it creates dependency in the expectation that proficiency and success is all about recall and repeat and memory and sort of following along, which actually couldn't be further from the truth. innovation is all about divergent thinking. It's all about thinking differently. And if all you think and all you can do as a student or as an adult is recall or repeat or summarize, then there's no seat at the table for you when it comes to innovation. There's no seat at the table for you where skills are required. And unfortunately, if all you do is know facts, you can be replaced by Google. So this traditional model of instruction is being retired. And when you think about next generation science standards, that skills focus, the three-dimensional focus of these performance expectations are all about a next generation inquiry model, and it takes developing, it takes grit to participate. And we have to develop that grit in our students, but also in our teachers. We need our classrooms and our schools to be a culture which supports a next generation inquiry model. It needs to be a culture of grit. So I'm going to just show you here how that's a little different. So the experience that we create in class has to bring those three dimensions to life in a meaningful context. So meaningful is also purposeful, and in a way that students are fully engaged in the practices of science and engineering. So the role of the teacher is to actually strengthen the connection between the students and their skills, help them understand how to engage as scientists and engineers appropriately. But the teacher to the side here is not getting between the student and their content. What the teacher is doing is acting as a coach. They're helping the students develop those skills, and then they're helping strengthen the connection. And I think about the content is, if we go back to this picture over here for a second, the content is the dirt and the plants. This teacher should be the one watching, and it should be the students who are fumbling around in the dirt trying to make it happen, okay, trying to figure it out on their own, and the teacher asking those higher order questions. That's how you fix the problem here, okay? That's what's going on in this picture on the right. The students are in there fumbling around with purpose, trying to pursue a goal, and that goal being, in this case, it's engineering, so they're solving a problem. But if it was science, they'd be trying to answer that question. And they have skills to do that, okay? And those are skills that the teacher has helped coach. And so that's why you see the teacher off to the side. Teachers need to be much, much more skillful under next generation science standards and a next generation inquiry model than they have to be under the old traditional model of, remember that sedimentary rocks are layered and made of layers of sediment formed through the rock cycle and pressure and time and so on. Well, the next generation model means that the students are working directly with that content, those disciplinary core ideas, and observing those cross-cutting concepts and connecting these different standards. That's why we teach standards not in isolation but in groups. That's why peak alignment calls for our curriculum not to teach lessons in isolation, but to teach them, standards in isolation, but to actually teach the standards in groups and to form lessons as experiences that take place over multiple days, not just sort of a 45-minute check the box kind of lesson trying to, we don't try to cover standards anymore. What we try to do is we try to view the standards as what they really are, performance expectations, and carry that forward, getting our classroom to be a place where students have the opportunity to engage the expectations and begin developing proficiency performing them. And they do that by developing and using the content, by using their skills to solve problems and answer questions on a regular basis. And I don't mean question like written in the book question. I mean a question that requires planned investigation that yields data. Okay, same thing with engineering. Identifying problems, but then actually prototyping, testing prototypes, and gathering data to see if that prototype concept that I came up with as a student using my science and engineering practices takes what I know and actually solves that problem, okay? That's what proficiency is all about under next generation science standards. It's about performing the expectations of the standards and using the system behavior to be able to understand the content and relate it to other aspects of content, but also describe the interactions among those different pieces of content or the phenomena, which are the cross-cutting concepts. So the teacher as coach is asking higher order questions. They're engaging in Socratic dialogue. They're helping students engage appropriately, but they're also helping adjust supports because there needs to be a full release of responsibility. However, it doesn't happen all at once. It typically happens over the first 10 weeks of school. Okay, so that's really key. I want to bring it back to grit and how that plays out in the classroom. You know, I think one of my favorite quotes from Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, is that effort counts twice, because effort builds skill, and at the same time, effort makes skill productive. So the way that classroom curriculum and lessons in the classroom inquiry environment needs to change is that it needs to require a lot of student effort. You may say, well, that's, seems contrary, because if we're going to require a lot of effort, we're going to get low engagement. Well, no. Effortful activity can be engaging, but it has to be purposeful. It has to be something where there is a full release responsibility. It has to be something that's student-centered. It has to be something that is relevant, that it's intentionally nurturing. It's engaging students in those practices, okay, and it's scaffolding from one grade level to the next, so we're teaching as teams. So for effort to be something that's achievable in the classroom, we need to be delivering effective STEM instruction, which is that definition we talked about a minute ago. And it's going to take place in that next generation inquiry model. And so, the talent that your students have, has an effect when it comes to skill development. But the key is that by kind of teaching positively, by creating an environment where you expect effort, and not just expect it, but you create challenges which require effort and are engaging because there is a benefit, a personal benefit to engaging in that task. A lot of folks will talk about task predicts performance, and it absolutely does. If you develop a lower level thinking task, then the best thing that you can expect out of that is lower level thinking. If you design tasks which require lots of effort, but there's a benefit to engaging in that effort, planning is a good example of this. Students planning their own investigations has a purpose when it's done first, and then students are allowed to carry out their own plans hands-on. And so students will engage in the effort to plan, and you can coach them in that process, and they can carry out those plans. So take the benefit of that effort and use it hands-on and actually observe something physically which is engaging, which is purposeful, and which has value in the greater picture, and actually develop skills. And so whether they have lots of talent or a little bit of talent is going to, change the rate at which those skills develop and the amount of effort that's required. But by creating a kind of culture where that effort has a benefit, and those lessons require the effort and have a benefit, you are going to see student skill develop. And that skill, along with that culture of effort, is going to produce achievement, because those science and engineering practices are skills which are required to develop and use the content and actually engage as scientists and engineers. They are going to be required by the next generation performance-based assessments. If you're from DC or Illinois, you've already seen these. You know what they look like. Okay, if you've been from a park state, okay, or even Smarter Balance, you've seen in an ELA context what performance-based testing looks like, where students are given a scenario or a passage and they are asked a series of questions that tease out not just their knowledge but their skills and their ability to analyze, evaluate, and create an explanation in that claim evidence reasoning type model. That's where skill plus effort produces achievement, because the skills are developed over the course of engaging in the purpose of the tasks that we've created. But then when those skills are called to task in an unfamiliar situation, we've sort of built the muscle of effort, and we have the tool set of skill to actually achieve. And so I think that these are two really key points that can't go, write these on the board. Forget writing standards and objectives on the board. Write this on the board, because this is what really matters. And the question, I think, becomes, as educators, how do we encourage effort? Because that's the thing. We know effort is tough. It takes energy. It takes focus. So as teachers, how we encourage effort in our students is, one, to let go of low-level goals. Okay? Don't keep the butterfly activity if it doesn't really serve a purpose, if it's only kind of a flash in the pan kind of thing. If it doesn't, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but if it doesn't hit our align well to our high-level goals, be willing to adjust those mid-level goals. If our high-level goal is to develop students' creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, one of our mid-level goals, so I'll use KnowAtom as an example. Our high-level goal is to develop students' creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, because those are skills that are useful for any college or career choice and any discipline. Our mid-level goal is to place students in the role of scientist and engineer, and to support educators in doing that in a full inquiry environment where there's a full release of responsibility and students are getting an opportunity every day to put the effort in, to see the purpose, to make the connections, and to develop the skills. And so the low-level goals, in terms of the exact materials we use, the exact content that we engage, the exact vocabulary, those are things that change. Those are things that change as data comes in from the field, as standards change, as different materials and different technology become more available or even less expensive or appropriate for application at a K-12 level. So with that in mind, exactly how that idea of butterflies, there may be something better than a butterfly. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people try to get into apps and things like this right now. Just to use getting an app or a software program just to use an app or a software program is a low-level goal that most of us could eliminate, because it doesn't, in the case of KnowAtom, if that mid-level goal is to place student in the role of scientist and engineer, there's a lot of other ways to do that. So we don't want that to be a barrier. So encouraging effort is the key, but having the right goals in the right places is how we kind of get there. And there's a few other things too. But let's just look at this for 1 second. So our top level goal is our end goal. And this is something that you'll see Angela Duckworth talk about in GRIT. Top level goals are our end goal. Mid-level goals are just those goals that we need in order to reach that end goal. And lower level goals are a means to an end. That's it. So if you were to ask a K-12 educator how they might arrange their goals, you might see something like this. And I pull this example because this is something that I saw somebody do, and I scratched my head a little bit. So, when you look down the bottom here, one goal is fun, okay? Another goal is hatching duck eggs. So the goal of hatching duck eggs, the reason we want to hatch duck eggs is because it's fun. And it also goes with our life science unit that we do in the spring. Well, why do we do a life science unit in the spring? Because that's where we can have our worksheets and our reading and our vocabulary, and we could extend this out further and say, why do we do it in the spring? Because that's when we can release the ducks. There's a lot of things it could connect to. But if you had something over here like releasing the ducks in spring, and then you have fun over here, those are competing. Okay, they're competing because the fun doesn't attach back in anywhere. Okay, the fact that life science has to happen in the spring doesn't attach back in anywhere. Now, worksheets, reading, and vocabulary can support the idea of having enough grades for report cards. And why do we do that? Well, maybe teaching the standards is something this person would say. And then covering, why do we do that? Because we have to cover what's on the test. And why do we cover what's on the tests? Because we want students to pass the test and graduate. And why do they do that? Because they need to do that for college and career readiness. Now, I don't want tons of people to sign out here seeing this. I'm not saying that this is a model by any means. I actually think that this is a model of somebody who struggles with the kind of things that we've been talking about. Okay, struggles with a traditional model of instruction, that struggles with creating goals and structuring curriculum and instruction so that it develops grit. Because what you have down here are really lower order activities. Okay, but if you were to try and take that model and say, well, what are the low-level goals, what are the mid-level goals, and what are the top-level goals, where we've segmented this, this is kind of where it would fall. Okay, lots of competing low-level goals, right? Worksheets, reading, vocabulary. Why do we do it? Just to get grades for report cards. The life science unit's purpose is really to just give us something that we can create worksheets and reading and vocabulary around for the grades. You know, one of the cool things we can do is hatch duck eggs because it's fun. None of this, you know, none of it's particularly valuable, and none of it's actually, from a next generation science standards perspective, would be really aligned. But from a mid-level perspective, teaching the standards, covering the test, and passing the test, you could see this. There's two pieces that are focusing on a test here. This is somebody who sees a test as the path to college and career readiness, and teaching the standards. I mean, just the saying teach the standards is sort of a, you know, has a project sort of sound to it. So I'm going to come back to this and show you how I think we can change this a bit to make a difference. So remember, we said that how do we encourage effort? It's letting go of low-level goals, being willing to adjust mid-level goals, and focusing on achieving the top-level goals. So if we were coaching that teacher who had created this sort of chain, I think we would strike out a lot of the pieces that they have as goals here. We try to reposition some of this. So our low-level goal would really be to challenge students. Okay, the fun, the worksheets, the reading, the vocabulary, the duck eggs, the report cards, none of this matters. It really doesn't matter. It's just a means to an end. And if it doesn't really serve the end result well, if it's not well aligned, if I can't draw a very clear line from grades on report cards to college and career readiness, then we ought to strike it. And the reason that we've struck it here is that, I mean, think about this from a teacher's perspective. You know, how many job ads can you find today that are going to ask what grades a student had on their 5th grade report card? Okay, there is not a direct line between grades and report cards and college and career readiness. Now, we might say that success in hitting certain milestones in 5th grade increases the success in students hitting milestones in 6th grade. And I think that, you know, is likely supported, just like we see with developmental milestones and reading and elsewhere. But the way that we grade and having that be a real goal is, you know, it's really secondary to other things. It's secondary to the challenges that we create. When you think about things like teaching the standards, it's not really about teaching the standards. It's about performing the expectations of the standards, and it's not about the teacher. It's about the students performing the expectations of the standards. That's the goal. That's why we have the challenges. The means to an end of challenging students is to develop the skills, to invest them in an experience which gets them to perform the expectations of the standards in a context that's unfamiliar, so that they are really, they're getting exposure, but they're also developing interest, and they're developing sort of a muscle. You know, this term is facetious, right? We don't have a effort muscle, but they are developing a kind of muscle for effort, and they become familiar with the expectations of the standards and how to analyze scenarios and how to perform those expectations. And as a result of being able to not only have developed skills, but to be able to use those skills to perform the expectations of the standards, we can draw a straight line between that and college and career readiness. Because if a student has developed skills and they can develop and use their content knowledge, then they are not only going to be able to pass a test and graduate, but they are going to be college and career ready. They're going to be able to perform and be trainable in a work environment, in a college environment, in a 2-year degree program, in a technical certificate program, or so on. That's what really matters. That's why it's our top level goal. And so bringing this in science and in next generation science standards, but let's bring this back to grit. Grit is about having the same top level goals for a very long time. You know, the top level goals are oftentimes values that we share with our peers in our building or at our grade level. Okay, there are things like, you know, frankly here at KnowAtom, goals that we share are creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, collaboration, communication, precision, the use of data, supporting educators with quality resources, and making sure that what we have is always aligned and the highest quality. Those are goals that we don't change. And in order for us to abandon something like that would be incredibly hard. So, you know, what this teacher had down below, in some cases the fun, and we could have had over here the springtime and testing and grades, these are actually in some ways competing hierarchies. Okay, and you know what we need to do is make sure that each tier of goals is ultimately related. So when you think about, like, to KnowAtom, you know, if our goals are higher order thinking and supporting teachers and so on, we don't create anything that doesn't support that goal. We don't conduct ourselves in a way that doesn't support that goal. Okay, and so it's also not okay to have a top level goal that's just, or to have only a top level goal. So for instance, you can't say in this example that the goal is to graduate or college and career readiness and have no mid-level or lower level goals, because that's what the psychologist Gabriel Oettingen calls positive fantasizing. It's having the short-term excitement of some positive aspirations in this, you know, big goal, I want to be a doctor, but having the long-term disappointment of not having a way to get there and actually achieve that goal. How do you become a doctor? Well, there are certain lower level goals that you need to set for yourself in order to reach that goal. Okay, you know, it kind of goes without saying that you're going to need some steps. So just like here, if the goal is college and career readiness, that means that we need a goal that students are going to be able to perform or demonstrate the expectations of the standards, and the way that they're going to become proficient at that is that we are going to have to challenge them in our classroom to develop skills, to develop and use the content, and to practice, in essence, performing the expectations of the standards, and to struggle with that appropriately, to put the effort in, and to become proficient. Okay, so having grit doesn't mean that you don't quit on goals sometimes. You know, like this teacher who would have come up with all of the things we crossed out. If you know they don't, if they are unwilling to abandon some of these things, you know, to refocus and to learn and to think differently, then they have a kind of fixed mindset. So we think about Carol Dweck's work, growth mindset. They have a kind of fixed mindset, and unfortunately it become debilitating, because the very things that we need to get rid of here are the things that are taking our time and energy away from the things that we really need to be doing and need to be focusing on. Okay, perhaps doing a life science unit in the spring can be challenging, but the challenge is the goal, not the life science unit. Okay, the life science unit is just a means to an end, and it may or may not be appropriate. So if it's appropriate, let's keep it as a thread of that challenge. If it's not, let's abandon it. Okay, that's part of this kind of growth mindset process, and some level of flexibility. So abandoning higher level goals is something that, you know, you should really be stubborn about, right? Like us here at KnowAtom, we aren't anytime soon going to abandon our focus on helping teachers develop their students' higher level thinking skills, creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. It's part of our culture. It's part of what we are, you know, out to pursue. So this brings into it, we keep talking about this word challenge. There's this new kind of definition of rigor that's important to think about. It's another one of my most favorite of quotes from Angela Duckworth and how she defines rigor versus flow. And this is directly applicable to these next generation science standards and the kind of environment we need to create in the classroom. Rigor, and it's like I cringe when people tell me, they care about rigor, and then I ask them, well, what is rigor? And they say, well, things that are hard. Okay, well, what is that? Well, we have to read a lot, or we have to, do our flashcards 500 times, something like this that's very much rote. Rigor, and this is how Angela Duckworth describes it, rigor is challenge that exceeds skill. And the importance of this definition, and I hope this is another one of those things you write on the board somewhere. Forget about your standards. Write this on the board. Rigor is challenge that exceeds skill, because that is where there is opportunity for growth. That's why things are hard. Okay? That is different than what she describes as flow. Flow is where the challenge is equal to your skill, where it meets your skill. That's where there's opportunity to practice skill. Okay, so that next generation inquiry environment that we were talking about, where teacher is coach, the role of that teacher is to maintain rigor by ensuring that they continue to move the bar. When they see students getting into flow, flow being a place where they can lose track of time, they have all the skills that they need to be able to do something. It's old hat at that point, right? They're getting too good. Then the goal of that teacher is to create rigor by moving the bar out and to challenge that student to develop more skill, to create the opportunity for growth. And this, so you need opportunity for practice, but you get that practice within the opportunity for growth as well. So you kind of go in flux between rigor and growth, right? You start out in rigor and you see students move to a place of flow, and then you try to move them back to a place of rigor. Okay? Has nothing to do with how many times you say a word. Has nothing to do with how many times you read a chapter and students can recall the facts and figures in that chapter. Okay? Rigor versus flow is really, really important in these new standards. This is different than what we see oftentimes when it comes to boredom. Okay? Students get into this place of boredom, and back to that teacher who made the comment, science is hard because students don't want to listen to me tell them anything, at the end of the day. I can't tell them an eighth thing at the end of the day. Well, for a student to sit there and listen, that is a level of challenge that is below the level of a student's skill. Certainly, when students are out of kindergarten, first grade, students have a level of personal control. They can sit in their seats. They don't need to learn how to listen. What they need is they need to be challenged to develop skill. They need to be given an opportunity for growth. And when they reach a level where they can practice that skill and they have that opportunity for practice, we move them back into an area for growth. We try to do that as rapidly as possible. If we put them into a place where they have to just listen or watch a video, or put them in a place where the level of challenge is below the level of skill, that's where we start to see withdrawal. That's where we start to see students fighting us. Okay? It doesn't mean that when we change from a traditional model of expectations to a next generation model of expectations that students aren't going to kind of buck a rigorous environment and try to seek an area of challenge where it meets their current level of skill. They're going to want to go for that flow. That's part of being a skillful teacher, is knowing how to manage and push that. But this level of boredom kills creativity. It kills the inquiry nature of a student. And I want to add this as well, that there's sort of a subcategory of boredom, which is entertainment. Unchallenging activities or tasks or environments of observation that just occupy time. So it's engaging students, right? They're going to watch a video, but it's unchallenging observation, it's occupying time, and it's not creating that opportunity for growth. that opportunity for practice. Okay, so I think these are key things to keep in mind. The next generation science standards set us up well for that. That's why we have these 3 dimensions. These are the skills, science and engineering practices. This is the content that skill needs to be applied within. And these are the phenomena that we're going to observe, and students are going to be expected to be able to demonstrate the expectation of the standard, which is what you see up here. It's really well laid out when you think about it in 3 dimensions this way. Okay, what's involved in developing that from a curriculum and a team perspective is not just knowing the standards, but taking that standards and developing it into a curriculum that's at least a school level curriculum, but really should be a district level curriculum that forms the supports for teachers in lesson plans and teacher background, and giving them, and you'll see this in our lessons, which you can check out if you go to KnowAtom.com and you go to the top of the screen. You'll say, I don't know, something like STEM curriculum or something like that. You can click on it and scroll down, and there's a sample of each unit that's there for each grade level, grades 1 through 8. And you'll see, we give teachers everything they needed to fully guide a lesson if they had to, but that's not the goal. At most, there's some groupthink at the beginning of the year, but the goal is a gradual release of responsibility and really meeting a full release of responsibility within that first 10 weeks of school, so that is what the student's experience is it's authentic, it's their ideas. We're just giving teachers exemplars to help them understand, sort of like the yellow line and the white line on the highway. There's a boundary, right? And so we're trying to help teachers understand what one place kind of in the middle of those left and right boundaries looks like, so that they can be more skillful and they can develop their gut and how to coach and develop students' skills in that student experience. And that's where the student learning comes in. Okay, through that student experience is where we get student learning, by that, what I said, the opportunity for challenge, okay, the opportunity for growth. And out of that is where we see evidence of learning. And this ties back to the standards because of the way that they are designed to the evidence statements. And this is what those evidence statements look like. We can give students a scenario, and they can take their skills and take their knowledge, and they can answer questions related to that scenario by analyzing it, evaluating, and creating their own explanations with evidence from their analysis and reasoning to be able to show that they can develop a model to describe the phenomena that includes the movement of matter within an ecosystem. Okay, and they'll have already appealed to the components of matter, plants, animals, decomposers, the environment, that they'll be describing those relationships, okay, like relationships that animals consume other animals and some animals consume plants and so on. And that they will be able to use that model to describe not only how matter flows through the environment, but also energy and how each of these organisms in that environment are connected through food chains and food webs. So when you think about it, the curriculum supports the educator in creating a space for an experience where student learning takes place and students develop proficiency, producing evidence of their learning. And it comes full circle when we think about that evidence as being directly tied to the expectations of the standards themselves. Okay, so as educators, how is it that we can encourage this grit in that environment? So if you think about back here, okay, that student experience, and so picture the teacher in the classroom there trying to promote that student learning so students can produce evidence of their learning. Well, be warm. Get to know students. Be thoughtful and be helpful. Okay? Be demanding. Just because you're warm doesn't mean, or you may say supportive. Just because you're supportive doesn't mean that you are not demanding. Being demanding means that you expect students to meet expectations, to point out areas for improvement, and do it on the individual level. This is not reaching out and saying, I notice everybody stinks today, or saying to a student that they stink. Be warm, be helpful, ask questions that cause the students to think deeper and in a direction that is helpful to them to become self-regulating on their own. By being demanding, it means that you don't expect less of any student, right? You don't view some students as being talented and others as not talented, but you hold all students to the same expectations, and that those expectations are at a level that exceeds the student's current skills. And by pointing out areas of improvement, what we can do is we can help students focus on their weaknesses, focus their effort on their weaknesses, okay? And this is actually part of what Angela Duckworth describes as parenting for grit as well. So if you're a parent listening to this, these are the same things. And you know, I think every teacher knows that they are in some way a parent of all their students, but I think this makes that point even clearer. Also, be respectfully authoritative and not authoritarian. A key difference between somebody who's authoritative versus authoritarian is, you know, whether or not you respect the student's contributions and intellect versus place your own thoughts and expectations above their intellect. And, you know, kind of, so authoritarian individuals are more black and white. Authoritative individuals are much more of a debating type individual who, you know, is going to ask hard questions and look for, you know, and not let, you know, something kind of slide by. But I think the way this plays out in the classroom is something to think about, is trusting students, okay? Being respectfully authoritative means that you trust your students. You actually trust is something that you give to the student, and you allow them to have their own opinion and take risks. Okay, that's very, very difficult for teachers in a traditional model, because you know what, if you take away trust and you take away freedom and you take away respect, then it's much easier to control students. You just be authoritative, you tell them what to do and they do it, and if they don't do what you do, then they're in the wrong, you're still in the right, and you know, they can be punished. If you trust students, students respond to that trust. If you allow them to have an opinion, they respond to that by stepping into the space and forming an opinion. If you allow them to take risks, they will step into that space and take risks, and they will learn how to do so appropriately. And by the way, when they, you know, take on that role that's trusted, they take on the opinion, the risks, and that actually all takes effort. And so this is part of training students to be gritty, as well as, you know, what we were just mentioning above. You know, stepping into a space takes effort, and so creating a classroom environment that is a space for that, you know, full inquiry environment, then we've created space for that effort, and we've also created this freedom, which and in a purpose to what we're doing that students will also value and take advantage of. So, you know, being authoritative, being respectful, being warm, being demanding, but not authoritarian. The last bit I think is important to mention too, is to help students question themselves, to help them understand that it's okay to question, it's okay to question yourself, and it's okay to struggle with things. That's part of taking risks. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we think things that are untrue. Sometimes we discover things we didn't expect, but that's okay. Those things can only happen in a space that allows for effort and freedom to be student-centered and so on. But, you know, one of the reasons people struggle with performance-based assessment, even in ELA, is that they have trained students just to listen for an answer, remember an answer, and put the answer in a blank. They haven't given students the freedom to think independently, to regulate themselves, to form their own opinions, and to question themselves and others. And so, you know, that's how we learn to correct our own mistakes and learn how to grow. So, you know, when we think about those next generation science practices, these blue words are words, you know, the whole thing, these are the skills required of the students in these new next generation science standards, they're the ones who have to ask the questions. They have to define problems. They have to develop a model, not only use it. They have to plan investigations. These are all skills they need to be able to demonstrate. Okay, they are demanding skills. They are skills where we have to have high expectations. A student is not going to learn to argue from evidence unless we, give helpful feedback, unless we hold those expectations high. We're demanding, and so on. So how we grow that grit in the classroom comes down to these four things. When we think about that rigorous challenge, it's something that's focused, it's exceeding skill, it's focused on weakness and resisting complacency. Developing student interest is all about engaging curiosity, fascination, and enjoyment. It's not, there's a difference between enjoyment, curiosity, fascination, and entertainment. Okay, if we can create a plan and we can carry that plan out, and what we're investigating is a question that has relevance to our lives, that makes it interesting. Because we've planned it, we have some curiosity and fascination with whether our plan actually works, and we can enjoy seeing the results. Okay, that's genuine interest. When we come down to practice, practice is that rigorous challenge. Practice is about being engaged in an environment and in tasks which require skill that we don't have yet as students. Okay, Angela Duckworth says that what ripens passion is purpose. That's when your students find their work personally interesting and connected to the well-being of others. And the feedback and demeanor we have as educators can foster or kill hope. Students will rise to the occasion based on the kind of environment we create. If we don't create space for students to take risks, are students ever going to take a risk? No. Are they ever going to rise to the occasion of risk taking? No. Are they ever going to have the hope that they, can succeed in an area that somebody hasn't told them how it should be done? No. They're not going to hope. They're not going to have hope in their own effort. And so they're not going to rise to the occasion and invest themselves in places that are unfamiliar. And so I think this is, this hope piece, everything feeds on hope, but hope is that place where Carol Dweck's growth mindset absolutely kicks in. It's exactly what we call the power of yet. That's what she calls the power of yet. It's that optimistic sort of self-talk and mindset that helps persevere over adversity, right? If you're going to take a risk, you know that you're taking a risk of mistake, a risk of non-success. And in science and engineering, you have a greater probability of being unsuccessful than successful when you take a risk. And so if you don't have hope, if you don't have an ability to rise to the occasion, then game over. And so interest, practice, purpose, and hope are sort of these tools that we use in that next generation inquiry environment as the coach to usher or guide students through what is a difficult process. It is difficult. It's because if we're challenging students appropriately, if it's rigorous, it's going to be difficult. So designing lessons with a purpose, this is one way that we do it here. How does that connect to the kind of common elements of a science class? Well, in KnowAtom, a lesson isn't just a day, it's a week-long kind of experience. And so we start with nonfiction reading, but the nonfiction reading has a purpose. It connects concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world. It gives that kind of purpose to the concepts and the vocabulary so that we can have group Socratic dialogue. And that group Socratic dialogue is where teachers are asking higher order questions of students and making sure that those connections are happening, and then leaps into the area of a problem or question where students could actually engage as scientists or engineers. And so those students can break into teams and plan their investigations using the skills and the content knowledge and the facts that they've learned so far to plan an investigation. But then the purpose of planning that investigation is being able to carry it out hands-on. So those student teams then go on to carry those investigations out, and the purpose of doing that is to gather data so that we can form evidence-based conclusions, share those back with the class, compare and contrast our results with the results of our peers, and look at different approaches to the same problem or the same question, and debrief. And we're doing this in a scaffolding way so that one lesson, those ideas and concepts have relevance to the next lesson. And that continues from one unit to the next and from one year to the next. And that's really how, we translate the ideas of grit and the sort of the pedagogical environment that we create in that next generation inquiry environment to organizational threads and the actual tasks that we carry out and the practices and the processes and the content that students are engaged in. Angela Duckworth says, ask yourself to what extent your goals serve a common purpose. Here, the reading serves the purpose for the Socratic dialogue. The Socratic dialogue serves a purpose for the problem or question students actually going on to plan. The plan serves a purpose in hands-on investigation inquiry. And that investigation yields an evidence-based or a claim evidence reasoning type conclusion, which can then be shared back. So purposeful. Okay. She also talks about Warren Buffett's 3-step process of writing down all your top-level goals and whittling that down to just 5, and then, looking at those that you eliminate as being a threat to those which are most important. And what I mean by that is that if you have things that are part of that lesson or unit that don't serve the purpose of the standards and of skills mastery and fit together the way this fits together, then whatever those elements are vying for your time on learning, they're vying for your students' attention, they're vying for your effort, they're vying for your resources, and they really should be tossed out. And we see that a lot with textbooks and worksheets and all the things people download off the internet and try to stick it all together, and it's marginally cohesive, but there are so many things about it that are kind of ill-fitting that they don't really serve a common goal. They don't intentionally nurture throughout the year, September to June, but also from one grade level to the next. So they conflict. They conflict with purpose. Poor organization conflicts with what's important. Okay. Thinking about how you arrange your class, arranging it for classroom management, but also creating a place where students are on the front line to actually contribute their ideas in that Socratic dialogue, to work together in teams, to check in with the teacher at milestones, and where in our case, we have all the curriculum, we have hands-on materials, professional development, all that kind of stuff. The planning comes first, and so students don't have materials when they're planning. Why? Well, because the plan is the purpose of the materials. It's the purpose we need materials. And so just the way you organize your class sets a tone for the expectations for students, and it can help focus them on purpose and engage them in the task. Same thing, we think about, why do we do anything hands-on? It's so that we, we do things hands-on, carrying out our plans. Why do we carry out those plans hands-on? So that we can develop evidence or develop data which we can analyze into evidence so that we can reflect on, let's say it's science, we can reflect on our question, form a hypothesis, make a claim about that hypothesis, use evidence to support it, and then reason that in writing. And so like at a 5th grade level, here's an example. We talk about things like claim evidence reasoning, but there's more to it. If we're really thoughtful and intentional, there's a lot more to it, and we can bring our students to a higher level of skill by having that rigor in the classroom and teaching them across all content areas. I think that's the key piece here, is that next generation science standards, like you see here, this is an evidence-based conclusion, the technical writing piece. What we're learning in these next generation science standards in 3 dimensions is not just a science skill. It's actually ELA and math common core. These are higher order thinking skills of creating, evaluating, and analyzing. But they require, it's an opportunity to develop students' grit. And that grit is not just going to benefit science time on learning. You know, when we think about this, the conclusion I showed you a moment ago, you know, when we form a conclusion about whether or not we solved a problem or whether or not we've answered a question, you know, that conclusion has a purpose. The reason we're engaging is that question and the hypothesis we were testing as scientists. Why we did the experiment, or you know, what we did to experiment, is guided by scientific or engineering process. Okay, that's how we create a plan. And using the results of that plan, the actual data gathered, is how we now understand our question or our hypothesis differently. Okay, so that's, you know, that's why we form conclusions. That type of thinking is rigorous, and it's something that benefits students, you know, entire lives and all content areas. I'll leave you with this, and I'll take whatever questions you have at this point. But you know, grit is a culture. It's a culture we can create in our classroom as teachers. It's a culture that we create in our schools and in our districts as leaders. And it permeates. The culture of grit that you create in your school or in your district is not just going to be, if you do it properly, if it's a true culture, is going to be a set of values that your first grade teachers share with your second grade teachers, share with your fifth grade teachers, share with your janitor, with your secretary, with yourself. That's what it means to have a culture and shared values. And a culture of grit is a culture that supports determination and direction. Because what you'll find is when you value determination and direction, that passion and that perseverance, that your team is going to become self-aware. It's going to support itself. Members of your team are going to support each other. But it takes leadership to get there. Just like it takes the teacher as the leader in the classroom to get students to develop those skills. If you are, you know, it's very few communities that are lucky enough to have a gritty culture to start with. But if you want to develop that gritty culture, you need to be the leader, whether you're a teacher or a principal or a superintendent. You need to, you know, be the voice and pull those values together and make those values visible and reward those values. You know, clap for people when they exhibit those values, and find ways of strengthening it, making it visible. And through that process, you'll see that people who don't have grit, who don't value your team's values, are going to disappear by their own choice. They're also going to, or they will fall in line and develop grit. Because that's the choice that they have is to, you know, I guess there's three potential options. Remain as you are, which will be incredibly wearing because nobody, you know, values perhaps a negative perspective, because everybody values, you know, being positive and you know, critiquing each other and helping each other grow. The person who doesn't value that is going to find it hard to exist in that environment. So they can sort of learn to participate, or they're going to decide to leave. The other thing, though, is that when people come to join your community, they are going to find that grit exciting. It's going to be polarizing in some way. So it's either going to be exciting, that you value, you know, passion and perseverance, or it's going to be intimidating because they don't value that, and so they will, you know, disappear. So anyhow, I won't go on much more about that, but I think, you know, I think that culture of grit is so important. And I think if you look at the Olympics, if you look at professional athletes, I think that you can see these are people who, you know, they practice, they push themselves far beyond the average person on an everyday basis. That's why they're so good at what they do. It's, you know, maybe there's some anatomical advantage here or there, but at the end of the day, that anatomical advantage without the effort is worthless because it goes undeveloped. And if you can create a culture of grit in your school, your classroom, where students and teachers and so on are developing their potential by virtue of being supported and and having these sort of values championed and so on, that's where the magic really happens, and people are the most successful. Okay, last couple questions here. I know we have run a bit late. I'll share the information. Some folks have asked for information. Okay, so a couple questions. Measuring grit. So I would recommend, so there are assessments of grit, and you can access some assessments of grit by checking out Angela Duckworth's website. You can just Google Angela Duckworth grit, or you can go to simonandschuster.com. And what you'll see is that there are these assessments of grit, and I can share with you a little bit about how that kind of works, what it seems like. So basically, an assessment of grit is a series of questions that people are asked, basically ask of themselves, and you assign points, kind of to the degree that you agree or disagree with that quality of yourself. So an example of that, so think of a 1 to 5 type scale, where 1 is, not at all like me, and 5 is, very much like me. And, one question would be something like, setbacks don't discourage me. I don't give up easily. So if you don't give up easily and setbacks don't discourage you easily, and you think that is very much like you, 5, then you're very gritty in that thread. Okay, there are other threads. I'm a hard worker. Okay, if that's very much like you, that is a characteristic that is strongly associated with grit. So you'd be a 5 on that scale. Okay, if you often set goals but later choose to pursue a different pursuit, that is not being gritty. So you'd be, if that's very much like you, you'd score a 1 on, that type of characteristic. But if you're gritty, you would score a 5 because that's nothing like you at all. Okay. Well, other questions, just to kind of give you an example. So, I often set a goal but later choose to pursue a different one. I'm a hard worker. I have difficulty managing my focus on projects that take more than a few months to complete. I finish whatever I begin. My interests change from year to year. I'm diligent and never give up. I have been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time but later lost interest. And of course, these flip, right? If I've been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time and lose interest, if that's a lot like me, I'm not gritty. Because gritty people don't do something for a short time and lose interest. They do something and they do it for a long time, a year, 2 years, more than that. And what's interesting is that, in Angela Duckworth's research, she has some interesting graphs that she's produced, is that, passion might get people started, but purpose is what keeps them going. And that grittier people are people who are more likely driven by purpose than by passion. And I think if anybody with some degree of life experience and perspective, perhaps on their own lives or lives of others, I think can understand why, right? That I think purpose is deeper than passion. Passion is fleeting at times, but somebody who's really gritty, that purpose endures, and so as you engage in something for a long time, you do so with both passion and purpose, but purpose trumps passion often. So there are measures of grit, which I would encourage you to check out. Check out Angela Duckworth's assessments. Other folks have asked about access to slides. Yeah, I'd be happy to share that if you want to email. I'd be happy to do that. Everybody will have access to video recording. It will be posted on the resources section of KnowAtom.com. Also, if you've signed up for this webinar, live webinar, we will send you a link to the video recording. And you're welcome to share that with folks as well. A couple other questions here. So somebody asking about peer-reviewed articles that suggest that these strategies will work to build grit. I would refer you to basically 30 or 40 pages of recommended reading that is at the end of Angela Duckworth's book Grit, which you can get at Amazon.com. Basically, she gives, I would say, hundreds of examples, peer-reviewed studies and so on that are evidence of how grit is formed, and exactly, so I guess, so the fine line here in terms of how grit is formed is that I think Angela Duckworth will tell you that she doesn't know what the magic wand is, but she has hunches about what sort of the characteristics of a grit forming environment are. And so in terms of what I've shared with you, it's built on that, and in terms of experience and also what we see in the classroom. But I would say if you really want to dig into studies, there's quite a few, and I would refer you to the appendix of her publication. So with that said, we're coming up at 90 minutes. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach back. We do have another webinar coming up in a little bit that is sort of builds out the sort of grit and next generation science connection further to mindset. And so we do have an upcoming webinar on mindset, which is looking at Carol Dweck's work and her recent publication, Mindset. And I believe that's happening in a couple weeks. But nonetheless, feel free. The best way to connect with that webinar is to do so either by email. Keep an eye on your email. You can follow our blog, KnowAtom.com/blog. There, all these are free resources. You can go to Facebook.com/KnowAtom and just follow us there. We tend to post when webinars are coming up, or even on Twitter @KnowAtom. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out by phone. You can reach Mary Ellen DeLacy. Was a teacher for many years. She's available at 617-475-3475, extension 2006, or by email at mdelacy@knowatom.com. And you're welcome to reach out to me as well. And my email's here. It's fvigent, V-I-G-E-A-N-T, @knowatom.com. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all, and I wish you luck. If you are looking for next generation science resources that fall in line with the ideas of grit or mindset, if you're a mindset district, particularly a growth, everybody has a mindset, but if you are focused on a growth mindset and developing these types of skills in your team and in your students specifically, I'd encourage you to take a look at the curriculum samples we have. They're used by lots and lots of kids all across the country, and teachers first, I suppose. And we'd be happy to work with you. Like I said, we are one of the few next generation aligned, hands-on, full inquiry-based programs that do span elementary, early elementary, and middle school. And if you're interested in this type of webinar, we are most likely a good fit for you. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.